Hi everyone and welcome back. Now if you've been watching this series, you know that we've covered so far a lot of attacks and mitigation techniques. Now we still have a couple more to cover before we can wrap this chapter up, and that's exactly what we're going to do right now. And because I hate the expression without further ado, I'm just gonna say let's not waste any more time and jump into the first one, which is privilege escalation. Now, privilege escalation, just like the name says, happens when an attacker manages somehow to gain access to some privileged resources that normally they wouldn't have access to. And by resource, I mean, it could be anything, like a file, a database record, a network location, anything that should not be accessible by regular users, or outside users, for that matter. And well, since normally when you access a system as a normal user, there's no legitimate way to promote yourself to a privileged user like a root or admin, then most privilege escalation attacks attempt to run some code with root or admin privileges by exploiting some vulnerability. So basically they're looking for a flaw in the software itself that might allow them to execute operations that would normally be allowed just for admins. And well, as you know, applications and processes run with the privilege of some account, usually a system account, and they have certain privileges as they need to read and write data, to interact with the system, to interact with network resources. So they do have some limited privileges. Now, exploiting such an application usually means injecting some customized attacker code into the application itself so that the application is going to execute the attacker's code with the application's permissions. So basically, if you find a web server that is running as root on a Linux machine and you manage to convince that web server to exploit it to execute your own code, well then your code will be executed as root on that specific machine. Now, of course, we also have legitimate privilege escalation in most operating systems, and sometimes these are exactly those operations that attackers attempt to exploit, such as sudo, that's super user do. It's a command that you can use to prefix other commands in a Linux environment in order to execute those commands with elevated privileges, most likely with root privileges. It's the equivalent of the run as administrator right-click option whenever you try to launch an application in Windows. Now, of course, not everybody has sudo or run as admin privileges. This is also going to be part of the privilege list of a specific subset of users. So basically, we have somewhat two layers of security here. First of all, we have just a specific subset of users that are allowed to sudo or to run as admin. And then secondly, those users also need to provide some valid credentials, either an admin password, a root password, in order to temporarily execute that set of operations with increased privilege. Now try this on Linux or Windows box and you will be prompted for an admin or a root password or a sudo password just to execute a privileged operation. Now how do we fight this? How do we mitigate this? As you can probably guess, the first step would be don't allow the application to be exploited as much as you can. So patch it, security updates and such. Secondly, make sure you use strong passwords, or even better, try using multi-factor authentication. So not just something that you know or the admin is supposed to know, but also something that you have, like a smart card or a one-time password generator, and even sometimes accompanied by something that you are, that is biometric identification. The face fingerprint, the retina scan and such. Don't forget to implement the least privilege principle. That is, don't provide more privileges to a user or to an application more than they require to do their jobs. Because in case that user account or that application gets compromised, well, the attacker is going to inherit all those permissions, and they most certainly are going to abuse those permissions. And of course, I cannot stress this enough, sanitize your input validation, because all that happens as a code injection, as a remote exploit, it all comes in as some sort of input. It doesn't matter if it comes through a web form, if it comes through the network, if it comes in an email or in a file that the application is supposed to open. It's all input. Always validate everything that you receive to minimize as much as possible the potential for exploits. And I don't really think I need to mention this here, but I'll just reiterate this one more time. make sure you remove any default credentials or you change the default credentials on your machines, because a lot of networking devices, servers, applications, they all have demo accounts, test accounts, maybe accounts that were used during the testing phase or during a POC. Don't forget about those. Also, don't forget that default passwords can be found all over the place online. So for example, on this, just an example website here, I want to find out what is the default password for, let's say, a Linksys router. Let's let Linksys on the left. And let's say WRT150N. All right, so its configuration can be accessed from this default IP address using a blank username and a default password of admin. That's a set of default credentials. Anybody can access this. Don't forget about these. Don't let them unsupervised. Don't leave them unsupervised in your environment. Now, just to put things into perspective, let's see an example of privilege escalation combined with grabbing the hashes, the password hashes from a live Windows system. Now, one thing to remember here, in all examples like these, demonstrations like these, they're all based on a specific type of vulnerability that we're trying to exploit. So if you try this on the latest and the greatest and the most up-to-date version of Windows, it's most likely not going to work. But not everybody is using the latest and the greatest updated version of Windows. That's how attackers get a real chance of hacking live systems. And it makes sense not to work on the latest versions because old vulnerabilities get patched every single day. So you need to discover new exploits, new vulnerabilities, and of course on the cybersecurity analyst side, you need to discover new methods of mitigating them. Okay, so let's see here an example. Now we're going to be using the Metasploit framework, which is by default available in security distributions like Kali Linux or Parrot OS or Parrot Security, like the one that I'm using right here. Now we're going to be building using MSF Venom a malicious payload that is going to be delivered to a victim. Then we need to trick that victim into executing this file. Now what this file does is going to be based on the reverse TCP payload, as you can see here in the command line. What it's going to do is it's going to attempt to connect back to ourselves. So the victim is going to try to initiate a connection back to the attacker, thus giving us access and a solid connection to that victim's machine, which we can then try to further exploit. And the address that we're using here is going to be denoted by the L host, which is the local host. That's our machine right now, 10.10.10.13. All right, so let's execute this. Okay, so we have one valid executable file. Now we need to push this file somehow to the victim's machine. So what we can do right now is we can upload it to a web location, for example. So in our lab here, we're also hosting a web server. It's an Apache 2 web server, and I'm just going to move that exe file in the root folder of Apache. Then we're going to start the Metasploit framework, and we're going to start a handler, which is just a piece of code that expects connections from potential victims. All right, so we need to make sure that we have everything in place on the attacker side as well. All right, so the payload is going to be also of type reverse TCP because we expect reverse TCP connections to go back to us. We're going to be listening on our own IP address. And we have the reverse TCP handler started on port 4444. All right, let's move over to the victim's machine right now. All right, we're pushing this executable file now to the victim's machine. We can give them a link to download the file direct. You can hide this link in an email or in an instant message. Just make sure that you convince the victim to run that executable file. Now, once that file is run, back on our Metasploit console, we can see that we have one session that has been opened. So we are seeing one connection back from our victim. Now, the victim is 10.10.10, as you can see here on the right, starting from port 5389, and the connection is created back to port 4444 on our machine. All right, we can now interact with this session. So we can basically just run commands just like we could directly on that victim's machine. Now, getUID is going to give us the name of the current user. In our case, it's going to be admin. Pay attention, it's not administrator, it's just admin. And just to make our life easier, we're going to be using here a dedicated tool called broot, which is just a small utility that is designed to look for misconfigurations on a Windows system that can be exploited for you to become administrator or broot. All right, so it's simply looking for opportunities to escalate our privilege. Coming back here to our Metasploit console, we can now upload this broot.exe to the victim's machine into their desktop folder. Right, we can then create a shell, direct shell or CMD shell on that victim's machine just by using the command shell, and then we're going to be running broot.exe. Now we do have some opportunity here for privilege escalation, so we're going to try to dump the hashes, the password hashes, from this newly compromised machine. All right, we're going to run smart hash dump for this. And as you can see, we don't have enough privileges to dump hashes just yet. Remember that the admin user was not exactly administrator, was just admin, okay? But we do have some good news from the broot executable that we can actually elevate our privileges. Now, one of the things that we found out by running broot is the fact that we can exploit a vulnerability that allows us to bypass UAC, that's user account control. That's the security measure that Windows uses whenever you try to execute some privileged operation, where it's going to ask you for permissions or even for your admin password. So you're going to have to bypass this by using a different type of exploit. All right, so we're going to use this exploit here to bypass UAC. So show options here tells us that we already have everything configured here. So localhost, that's our IP address, local port, that's our listening address. And we also need a valid session, and we do have an active session as well. Okay, so let's set that session to number 1, the exact same one that we currently have running. Okay, so we have a target set up from the active session, and we can just run exploit now. All right, you can see UAC is enabled, checking the level. Bypass UAC can bypass this setting. That's good news, right? Continuing. Okay, gonna make some changes in the registry. And right now, if we type get UID, we can see that we are still admin, so the same user as before, but we can call the bypass UAC exploit by using get system. Okay, apparently type 1 is not necessary here, so let's just write get system like this. All right, so we got system, which means we got root, we got admin privileges. Let's type, actually, let's check this out. Get UID again, and this time we're not just the administrator user, but we're actually the system user. That's the supreme user account, machine account actually, on any Windows system. So we can do anything that we want right now, including getting all the user password hashes. Okay, we can run the smart hash dump command as well, and there you have it. Now these are all the users defined on the system, starting with the administrator user, and the first code right there, the code for 500, tells us that that is a real administrator user, and all the password hashes listed right here. So you can just take these Windows hashes, these NT hashes, and just dump them in a brute force password cracker, in a dictionary cracker, or a rainbow table, anything that you have at your disposal to try to find out what the passwords for these accounts are. Or even better, now since you have access, administrator access to this system, you can just create your own user. That's your own admin user hidden from everybody else, so that you have a permanent backdoor whenever you want to come back and control this machine in the future. One more thing that any let's say well-educated attacker should do is, of course, to clear their traces. So clear EV is going to clear the logs. So it's basically clearing the system events so that they won't be visible. So there you have it, combined privilege escalation and grabbing password hashes from a live system. And by the way, that's Windows 10. So don't think that we're hacking, I don't know, Windows XP or something like that. It's just Windows 10 that doesn't have the latest and greatest security updates. Another type of attack, which unfortunately is not among the most popular ones nowadays, but it's still going to be relevant for the exam, is called pass the hash, or pass the hash attack. The main idea behind pass the hash, or PTH, is the fact that most services will hash your password and then check for those two hashes to match, the one that's calculated and the one that's stored in the local database. Now, some services, older versions of Kerberos especially, so older versions of the authentication and authorization process in Windows, would allow an exploit where you would just have to present a valid password hash without even knowing what the underlying password is, and then you would be granted access. That's why it's called pass the hash. So we're not passing over the password, we're passing the actual hash, which can be harvested, can be determined if you manage to break into one of those devices. You don't even have to know what the original password is. You just present a hash and you are given access. As I said, this is only relevant for older versions of Windows, but keep in mind that even newer versions of Windows still allow you to activate a backwards compatibility mode with older versions of other Windows clients, for example, that you might have in your network. If somebody's still using Windows XP in your network, or even older versions of Windows, you will probably have to activate those backward compatibility features. And this also is going to expose you to these legacy types of attacks. Now, one more idea here regarding Kerberos, and we're not going to go into too much detail here because this is more like Security Plus content. This is described in much greater detail in Security Plus. But we have the concept of a golden ticket. And the golden ticket is a type of identifier that can grant any permission in an Active Directory domain, including admin permissions. And the problem is that on previous implementations of Kerberos, dumping the Active Directory data store provided access to something called the Kerberos ticket granting ticket hashes. So we're basically dumping something similar to a root password of the system that we can then use later on and provide admin credentials, admin rights to any user inside of the domain, including, of course, malicious users. Keep in mind this as a concept for the exam. You don't need to know how to configure it. You don't even know how it is implemented for the CySA Plus. I would encourage you to read more about Kerberos, but it's not exactly the focus of CySA Plus. As I said, this is much greatly covered in Security Plus. But remember the golden ticket, what it does, and that it applies to Kerberos. That should be enough for the CySA Plus. Finally, another one that you've most probably heard about before is called man-in-the-middle, or the man-in-the-middle attack. And in most cases, this expression is used in a networking environment. So we're talking about network traffic that gets intercepted by a third party. Now, intercepting that traffic, of course, enables the third party, the attacker in our case, to inspect your traffic, perhaps to make changes into your request or replies. Now, on the other hand, this is still one extra hop in the communication path. So optionally, for a successful man-in-the-middle attack, the attacker doesn't just grab the traffic, inspects it, and discards it, but it also forwards it to the proper destination, so that in an ideal man-in-the-middle attack, the attack itself is not even going to be visible or detectable by the victim. And a man-in-the-middle attack doesn't just apply to networking traffic. It can also apply to software, which in most cases is going to be some sort of code injection into an application that intercepts whatever the user does. It's also called, in case of web applications, man in the browser. So imagine you have a compromised browser because you just clicked on some link or executed some binary file that you received over email or over instant messaging, and your browser gets infected. Now, when you're interacting with different websites all over the internet, your commands, your clicks, whatever you're typing into a web form, or even screenshots of your activity might be forwarded to some attacker's computer. That's a man in the browser. So basically, the attacker intercepts your action through an infected browser. Also, an example of man-in-the-middle attack could be considered the actions of keyloggers, small programs that run hidden on your machine, again installed as a result of some malicious code execution that grab your keystrokes, grab all your websites that you're visiting, all the passwords that you're typing at the keyboard, and then saving that information or even sending it over the network to some attacker's workstation. Now, a very, let's say, classic example of man-in-the-middle is by performing an ARP poisoning. ARP stands for Address Resolution Protocol, and it's what we use in our local networks, in our switch networks, to find out the MAC addresses, that's the layer 2 addresses of the devices we want to communicate with. So, for example, in this simple network here, let's assume that host A wants to communicate with server 1. It already knows server 1's IP address, it's right here, but it doesn't know server 1's MAC address, so it has to perform an ARP request to find out this MAC address. So host A is going to build a small packet here, which is going to contain something like this: who has IP address 10.0.0.1. And this packet here, since it doesn't know who has it, is going to be sent as a broadcast, which means that the switch here is going to make sure that the message gets received by all the hosts in the same network segment, including server 1, of course. Now, host B is going to ignore it because they don't have this IP address. Host C is going to ignore it as well. Server 1 is going to accept it, and it's going to build a reply saying, I do. All right, and this I do here is going to go back to the switch, and this time is going to be a unicast transmission directly to the original requester, that is host A. Now host A knows both the IP address and the MAC address of server 1, and communication can flow seamlessly between the two. Now the problem with ARP is that it's a very old protocol. It was invented pretty much at the same time as the rest of the Ethernet technologies, which is almost 50 years ago. And nobody was thinking about security back then, which means that ARP has somewhat of a too trusting behavior when working inside of a network. In fact, it's so trusting that if a host receives a message, an ARP reply, like this blue one here generated by the server, if any host receives this reply, is going to learn whatever is written in that reply, even though they haven't sent a request from the beginning. They did not ask for it. They're still going to record the information in this ARP reply, which means that for an attacker, this is a gold mine. Let's go back to the beginning of this. And let's assume that host C had suddenly become malicious, right? So this one is now red. This one is now an attacker. Now, as an attacker, host C can actually craft its own ARP replies and can simply build an ARP reply, and this ARP reply here is going to say that IP address 10.0.0.1 has the MAC address of CDEF, which is actually the MAC address of the attacker. Now, when this packet gets sent over the network, it can be a broadcast, can be a unicast, but let's assume that the attacker is just targeting host A here. Now, when host A receives this packet, the information within the packet will tell host A that whenever they need to reach server 1, they should use the MAC address CDEF. So host A is going to assemble its packets, thinking that it's communicating with server 1, while in reality, the MAC address that the switch is going to use to direct that packet is going to be the MAC address of host C. So basically, all the traffic that leaves host A towards server 1 is going to go first through host C, which can perform a man-in-the-middle. Normally, it should also forward it to the legitimate destination, which is server 1, so that host A is not going to even realize the fact that its traffic is being intercepted. Similarly, if server 1 is going to send their replies back to the attacker should forward them back to host A, so that host A can see that communication with server 1 still works. Now, unfortunately, it does, but host C here in the middle is going to intercept all that traffic. And this one is called ARP Poisoning. Now, in order to mitigate this, we have two technologies that can work together. The first one is called DAI, that is Dynamic ARP Inspection, and this one is configured on the switch, which means that the switch is going to now look at all the ARP requests and replies and determine if they come from their legitimate switch ports. How does it know which switch port is legitimate or not? Well, that's why we said we have two technologies here. And the second one is actually called DHCP snooping, which is also configured on the switch as well, and allows the switch to look at all the DHCP messages, that dynamic host configuration protocol, the protocol that you use when you connect to a network the very first time, that allows you to receive a valid IP address and DNS information and everything else, looks at those requests right here in order to determine where is each IP address and each MAC located on its switch ports. This way, if we have these two enabled at the same time, host C here would not be able to fake an ARP reply pretending to be server 1, because the switch is going to deny it. The switch knows that server 1 is not located on this connection right here towards host C, so it's not going to accept any ARP replies that claim to be server 1 coming from this switch port. So these two together here are going to solve us the problem of ARP poisoning, but you do need to have support for these on the switches, so you're probably going to look at managed switches, more expensive ones, and also you need someone who knows how to configure it and knows about these technologies. You might pay for them, but if nobody activates them on a switch, you're just as exposed. Now, don't forget about DNS either. That's the service that resolves the website names that we're accessing to real IP addresses that we can communicate with. Now, traditional attacks against DNS servers are going to be the traditional attacks against any type of servers out there: email, web, instant messaging, whatever they are. And just like any application that accepts some input, there might be some vulnerabilities regarding buffer overflows. And as we've seen in a previous video, a buffer overflow can have any number of consequences. It can allow us to change the information that is stored in the web server, it can allow us to crash the web server, or it can simply allow us to read some information as part of the reconnaissance process before an attack. Another type of attack that can be performed using DNS is DNS amplification, and the amplification attacks are actually a specific type of attacks that don't just apply to DNS, but to any protocol where the initial request can be disproportionately small in comparison to the reply. Now think about it this way. If you're accessing a website, right, you're sending a HTTP GET request perhaps for a resource on that website, which might be a file. Well, that file might be 1 gigabyte in size. How small is the request? How big is the reply? All right, that's also a potential for an amplification attack, and this is also a kind of denial of service attack. Now with DNS, we can kind of obtain the same result here, because DNS requests are very small, but the results from the DNS database of that server can be huge. Now, how does this help us? Well, at the most, we would probably just flood ourselves, right? We would probably just perform a denial of service on ourselves, right? Well, what if we send those DNS requests with a spoofed source IP address? So instead of just sending those DNS requests with my IP address as the source, I'm going to send those with somebody else's IP address as the source. That's not a legitimate packet, but unless there is some device in the network that can filter my traffic, it's going to be allowed. So I can just send a DNS request with your IP source address, and the response is going to come back to you. Send 1,000, 1,000,000 DNS requests, all with the same spoofed IP address, and you just got a denial of service, receiving 1 million or 1 billion DNS replies at the same time on your IP address. How to fight against DNS attacks? Well, just like with any other service out there, make sure it's up to date, all security patches installed, do some penetration testing from time to time just to see if new vulnerabilities might have been discovered in the meantime. And also, since DNS as a service is designed to be exposed, to be available to everyone out there, especially for public accessible resources or public websites, which are the most vulnerable, implement some sort of a block list, right, that can filter out those undesirable sources of traffic. If at some point some IP address on the internet attempted a buffer overflow or attempted a denial of service on your server, just ban that IP address. Don't allow them to communicate with you anymore. Finally, and this is the last one for today, rootkits. Rootkits are a type of kernel level malware, and they're usually based on infecting or even replacing operating system level files. So you're going to end up with a different executable file for cmd.exe, or a different executable file for notepad.exe or calculator.exe, except that the new executable file is infected with malware. And if you think, okay, those are not necessarily system files, all right then, it can infect DLL files within Windows, drivers that get loaded whenever you boot your computer. That's exactly the same behavior. The same driver, the same DLL file is going to be loaded into memory, but it's going to have an added bonus of a malicious code in there, which on top of all is going to run with root or administrator privileges, because those files are loaded by the operating system when it starts. Now, the silver lining here about rootkits is the fact that in order to install such a rootkit, you do need to get root access, because otherwise you won't be able to replace operating system level files. So that's an extra security measure that makes rootkits not so easy to be implemented. How do you mitigate this? Well, of course, since it's malware, it's malicious code, use an antivirus, an updated antivirus. And secondly, since we're talking about the changing operating system level files, those files should be stable, at least from one update to the next, right? When you update the operating system, perhaps a couple of those operating system level files are going to be changed, but nevertheless, they are going to be signed, they're going to be pre-authorized, and you can have a clear picture, a clear image of how a clean installation of Windows, of Linux, should look like. Which means that in order to protect those files, you can simply watch them and see if their contents change over time. And we have dedicated software that does this. It's called FIM, or File Integrity Monitoring, which does exactly that. It simply creates some handles and attaches them to operating system files, and whenever a change, an unauthorized change, is detected in those operating system files, then an alert is generated. How do you detect a change in a file? Well, we know this already. You hash that file, and whenever you detect a change in the hash of that file, you can be pretty sure that somebody changed the contents of the file itself. Now, as far as file integrity checkers go, the exam is most likely going to ask you about Tripwire. So make sure you remember that Tripwire is one of these file integrity checkers monitoring solutions, especially designed for Linux and it has a bunch of functionality in here. It uses a local database to keep track of all the files, and it monitors not just the hashes of the files, but also attributes such as last time accessed, last time modified, who owns those files, and stuff like that. Okay, you can see the integrity checking mode here. So make sure you remember for the exam Tripwire as the #1 example for file integrity monitoring. An alternative to Tripwire is FileSite. This one is a bit more complex and relies on agents installed on the workstations, which communicate to a centralized console. And agents are called satellites, as you can see here. And you can test it by creating a secret file, adding some contents inside of that file, and then moving over to the admin console. You can add a new monitor here, specific for files. I'm going to choose File Monitoring. Also to generate actions for each event separately. And as the monitor actions, I'm going to define our own actions list. Let's say we want to add the user to the blocked user list. All right, we can run this policy now. And let's make some changes here. Add more content to the secret.txt file. Go back to the administration console. You're going to see all the detected events. And one of them related to Notepad is going to be the exact write operation that we performed on secret.txt. So FileSite successfully detected that the contents of the text file have been changed. Right now, assuming that somebody tries to delete that file, let's see how FileSite reacts to this. So let's go back to our administrative console here. And in just a few seconds here, we should be able to see an alert. There it is. User account was added to the blocked user list, just like we specified in the policy. And this is just a very simple example of a much more complicated file monitoring solution. Now, this really was a pretty huge chapter. Congratulations if you made it this far. Remember that we talked about man-in-the-middle attacks and we exemplified an ARP poisoning attack. Now, that's not going to be the only type of man-in-the-middle attack, but make sure you understand what's going on in there for the exam as well. Also talked about DNS and how it can be attacked, and about rootkits. Know what they are, and at least remember Tripwire, because that's most likely going to be a tool that the exam is going to ask you about. Make sure you understand everything we talked about past the hash attack, and remember that it also relates to older implementations of anti-hashes, so it's all about Windows systems. Also talking about Windows systems, don't forget about the golden ticket attack, and remember that it relates to Kerberos. Alright, so for next time, we're going to talk about IOCs, that indicators of compromise, and we're going to talk about them in much more depth. If you found this informative and useful, make sure you like and subscribe, because that's all I need to keep this channel going. Thank you so much for watching, and good luck until next time.